In this video, I'm going to use a decision tree to identify what is the correct test. This is specifically for null hypothesis tests for mean differences across groups with one independent variable. There's a different video that talks about when you have multiple independent variables and when you have something other than a mean that you're comparing across groups. So our first step when we're talking about comparing means across groups is we need to know how many groups there are. I'm not including one sample t-tests if we're looking at a group compared to a population, just because they're not used very frequently. So this is specifically across at least two groups. So we have, if you have two groups versus if you have three or more groups, you're going to branch off in different directions here. If we have two groups, so we'll start with two, we want to ask, are the groups independent? So what I mean by that are, do we have two different groups? Do we have groups that are not related to each other in some way? So for example, if you did an experiment and you had two conditions and you randomly assigned half of your participants to one of the conditions and half to the other condition, those would be independent groups. You might also be comparing men versus women across groups. And so if that were the case, the groups are mutually exclusive. You identify as one or the other. Now, if the groups are independent, our next question is, can we assume that we have a normal distribution and other parametric assumptions for a test? So as long as you have at least 30 people in your group and your variable, your dependent variable is continuous, then we can continue along this path. So we're looking at means across groups so that we're talking about continuous variables that we're comparing across groups. So if it is parametric, we can conduct an independent samples t-test. The alternative, one alternative option is that you can conduct a Welch's t-test. And it works like an independent samples t-test. You're still comparing means across groups. It's just that it's a correction for when you have unequal variance. So when you violate homogeneity of variance, which we can test for, then you can conduct the Welch's t-test and it corrects for the fact that your groups are really different, basically. If you do not have a parametric test, so let's say that you have a very small sample size or you violate the parametric assumptions in some other way, then you can do a Mann-Whitney U-test. Now, if you do not have independent groups, if your groups are related, for a within subjects test, for example, within subjects experiment, let's say that you randomly assign participants to complete the two conditions in different orders. So everybody does every condition, you're comparing them against themselves. So you would have two scores on your dependent variable, but for the same people. So each person has two different scores that you're comparing. Again, if it's parametric, the option would be the dependent samples t-test. It's also commonly referred to as the paired samples t-test or even the related samples t-test. And then our non-parametric option is we can do a Wilcoxon signed rank test. If you have three or more groups, you ask yourself the same questions. Are the groups independent? If yes, the question that you would address, is it parametric? If yes, you're going to do a one-way ANOVA. Again, for this test, you have an option to use the Welch's F test for unequal variances between your groups. And then if it's non-parametric, you're going to do a Kruskal-Wallis H test. The next, going back up to, are the groups independent? If you do not have independent groups, so for example, let's say you're doing an experiment within subjects and you have three conditions that you're looking at, and everybody completes every condition, so you're comparing people's scores against themselves in each of these conditions. Then you, if you have a parametric test, would be a one-way repeated measures ANOVA. For the Friedman test, this is your non-parametric option when the groups are not independent and it is, again, not parametric. One note is that You can use the non-parametric tests. You should use them if you have ordinal variables. And so this is specifically talking about comparing means across groups. So again, this is focusing on when you have a categorical independent variable with two or more groups, and then your dependent variable is continuous. But again, these tests can be applied in different ways. So that is the end of this video. And again, there are future videos that you can look at for further information.